Hi, I'm Will. I'm the founder of RhinoFi, which is an all-in-one platform for DeFi, and I'm going to be speaking about Rollup Wars, L2 Wars, and the battle that's coming between all the different scaling solutions in the Ethereum space. So I'm going to start off talking a bit about the history of how we got to this position where there are so many different competing scaling solutions. Then I'm going to do a bit of a roundup of the Rollup ecosystem and how it looks today, and then talk about what tools different rollups and competing scaling solutions have to sort of battle each other in the next few years, and then what an eventual vision for peace could look like for the Ethereum space. So to start off, how did we get to where we are now? And we've seen over the last year or two this complete explosion in terms of especially EVM rollups, but also other types of rollups. But in the beginning, there was just Ethereum, and everyone was very happy. We got smart contracts, composability, and DeFi started to emerge on Ethereum. But that brought with it some new challenges. We saw congestion, high gas prices, slow block times. And so this initial vision was that everything would be really simple. We would just create layer 2s on Ethereum, and people would be able to migrate up there, do many of their transactions, and come back to Ethereum layer 1 when they needed to. And these were some of the early layer 2 solutions that we talked about. There weren't that many, and Diversify was actually RhinoFi before we rebranded. But in reality, what we see today looks much more complex. And we have not just layer 2s, but we also have layer 1s, which are also EVM compatible. We have layer 3s now coming, and all of these different rollups, chains, connect together via a complex set of bridges with different trust assumptions. And so for users, this is a really confusing, complicated situation. It's getting harder and harder to navigate, harder and harder to know what trust assumptions are being made in the different applications that you're using. And so we need to figure out how to get out of this situation and how we solve it. But that's just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, we're going to see thousands more rollups launch. And so far, we've only really just scratched the surface. It's getting easier and easier to launch a rollup. And 95% of them will likely never reach sustainable usage and will end up dying out. So we're going to see during that period a really brutal technological race, a competition for attention, and also a price war potentially over fees, which might be good for users. So where are we today? What's the current state of the rollup ecosystem? And first, before I go into that, I want to just talk about the kind of business model of an L2. So an L2 is a two-sided market. You need to attract builders and liquidity to come and create something on this sort of rollup or layer 2, and then that will hopefully lead to attracting end users to also come there. If that's successful in building that ecosystem, which is already sort of a big question mark, you can charge transaction fees to the users of that ecosystem. And in the basic sense, the rollup is then paying the L1 for security in return. And as long as the fees that you charge to your end users are less than the security cost you're paying to the L1, you're happy because you're basically profitable as a rollup and you're sustainable. And so we can see that today in some of the rollups that exist. So for example, Arbitrum is already making very high sort of annualized revenue on the transaction fees, which is much higher than the security cost that they're paying to Ethereum, and they're able to currently take an average sort of 30 to 40% profit margin. And today, these are centralized sequences on all rollups, so that's kind of going to the DAO or to the teams. In future, that might be some sort of decentralized sequencer network, but still essentially the same sort of business model applies. Optimism is in a similar position today, now charging much more transaction fees than they're paying to Ethereum. That's not the case for all rollups yet. So based on that, there are certain levers that each rollup has to determine if they're going to be a success. First of all, can you attract that ecosystem of builders? It's very difficult to do. Can you then attract end users? What fees are you able to charge to users for using the rollup? And then what costs do you need to pay back to L1 for security? And all these things are going to be affected by competitive dynamics between the different rollups, and there's going to be a push on many of them based on competition. And so now let's go on to kind of the market share and statistics today. So looking over the last few years, we really, on the big picture, haven't seen yet any of the rollups or EVM chains take a big share from Ethereum. We've definitely seen it start to happen, but we are still very early. And that's clear when we look into the data. And it's similar when you look at TVL. So although there's growth happening, and you can see, for example, significant growth on some chains like some rollups like Arbitrum, overall, these are still very small compared to Ethereum's dominance. And so we haven't reached that kind of critical mass yet of people switching over to use mainly rollups or L2s. But if we sort of look just today, we can see now some traction starting to happen on the top rollups. So for example, in TVL, we've got some clear winners at the moment: Arbitrum, Optimism, and ZK Sync era, with others sort of mainly lagging behind, but starting to gain some dominance in terms of TVL, and it's very similar in terms of transactions per second. There are other rollups which definitely are starting to really get traction now. So if we look at Starknet, and particularly seeing, following the recent upgrade, they've had a big tick up in TVL and steady growth before that. And so starting to really come into that tier. Similar, Polygon ZK EVM sort of trending up very strongly. And the very recent launch of Linear, only now 24 hours in, but growing quickly. But this is still very early. Again, we've got hundreds more rollups still to launch. So Base very soon by Coinbase, Tyco, Scroll, and Starknet continuing to kind of add many upgrades. And on top of that, it's getting even easier to launch blockchains because of things like sort of modular blockchain tooling, such as the Espresso shared sequencer and Celestia Rollkit. And just to mention that one for a moment, so Celestia is basically a data availability network, making it, but they have something called Rollkit, which by their own description is basically aiming to make it possible to deploy a sovereign rollup in minutes. So it's going to get so easy over the next year or two as this technology becomes easier and easier to use, that we will really be able to see anyone launching a rollup for anything they want to use it for. So given that context, that we're going to see even more and more of these chains, what are the tools that they have in order to compete and differentiate themselves? And the first that's very strongly important to users is clearly cost. And I think today we're seeing already a lot of competition happen on cost for attracting DeFi users and people to come and even explore many of these newer rollups. So this is data from actually just yesterday, but it's pretty representative of how things look across these different networks. And what we see at the moment is that the cost on ZK rollups is slightly higher, around the kind of 30-cent mark, whereas optimistic rollups tend to be a little bit cheaper, and that other sort of EVM chains are even cheaper, but maybe have not the same sort of L2 trust assumptions and bridges. But over the long term, those cost factors look different. So ZK rollups are currently more expensive, but they have an advantage at larger scale. So we should see transaction costs on those continue to reduce as they get more traction, making them long-term actually very competitive and maybe better in terms of cost than the optimistic rollups. All rollups are going to benefit from EIP 4844 and proto-danksharding, which will reduce costs significantly and maybe even get us to the point where, for the moment, this doesn't become such a factor in competition. And there's also choices that you can make between, for example, fully on-chain data availability, Validium, or using other data availability services like Celestia. So if cost is becoming less important as the ecosystem continues to mature, community, on the other hand, is clearly the kind of biggest area that I think is the hardest to compete on and where rollups are really focusing at the moment. And we've seen some good examples around launches of chains like Optimism and ZK Sync, where you can do many things with grants, building a strong culture and community, a very recognizable brand, and working on decentralized governance and ecosystem growth. And the tools available for these often have been related to token economics. I think it would be, we have to mention the fact that airdrop hunting has become like one of the big factors in early adoption of many rollups. And for small adoption, and active addresses has been like the biggest driving factor from the data. But longer term, bigger scale economic incentives, using the token for growth, or helping build a kind of sustainable DeFi ecosystem that can then grow sustainably has been very important, and we can see that happening, for example, in Arbitrum. So that's kind of now, but I think longer term, interoperability becomes equally important. So finality is one of the primary limiting factors for being able to have good interoperability, and shorter finality times basically enable faster bridging and faster interoperability. So ZK rollups theoretically can have shorter finality than optimistic rollups, but the lines are becoming very blurred with things like committees providing soft finality or hybrid models on different rollups. And we also have concepts like light chains, similar to IBC, for optimistic rollups, for example, like Polymer. But if we look at data today, the number of fast and low-cost bridging options correlates very strongly with the growth in user activity across rollups and EVM chains. And in this context, quality does matter more than quantity of bridges, but a very loose metric is that we can see basically the level of adoption correlating with the number of bridge options. So let's dive into that a bit more and talk about the most recent theme that we've had mentioned of superchains, hype and hyperchains. So Optimism, for example, has announced that they're really focusing now on the superchain. So what does that mean exactly? Basically, it's a concept that in the Optimism ecosystem, we're going to have many different OP chains built on the OP stack, and they're all going to be linked by a cross-chain messaging protocol. So that's going to give many advantages potentially to chains that are in that ecosystem. But basically, it means they can have shared ordering of transactions, shared security, but really importantly, shared communication protocol between all these OP chains. It's going to take some time to get there. This isn't something that happens overnight, but that vision is very interesting, as it means that all these chains have a basically free and instant low trust communication protocol. And that concept isn't completely new. If we look, for example, at Cosmos and Polkadot, you can see a lot of parallels between this superchain concept for rollups, and this was something that's been sort of evolving outside of the Ethereum ecosystem and tested out for many years. And importantly, Cosmos IBC really has a lot of parallels to that cross-chain messaging protocol. And that's not the only team that's sort of linking to that vision in the Ethereum rollup space. So Polygon has also announced Polygon 2.0 with unlimited scalability, unified liquidity, and really when you look in that, that's the same concept of this cross-chain communication protocol. And similarly, ZK Sync have also announced hyperchains and using the ZK stack with a cross-chain communication protocol. So we're seeing this kind of unified vision of a network of rollups connected by a completely low-trust native protocol sort of evolve simultaneously across all these different rollup technologies. So where can that lead us in terms of the future of this ecosystem? One option, and some people do think this is what's going to happen, would be that we get to a single survivor, one massive rollup that gets so much adoption that there's no point anyone else building there. It becomes so cheap because you're able to get the kind of economies of scale of having all transactions on this one rollup. And I think actually that's not something we necessarily want. Although it may sound appealing, we saw when we think about the business model that we want competition between rollups. It brings down cost, it brings other benefits for users. And also, I think it's unrealistic. What we've seen happen in the layer 1 space has not been one single chain have full dominance. It's been this constant iteration and evolution and competition, which is good for decentralization. So the alternative would be that we want to have many different rollups, which are already starting to evolve, living together, but with a really low-risk protocol-level interoperability between all of them, so that from a user point of view, they can sort of almost be agnostic of these different chains and benefit from all the trade-offs that they're each making. So users are going to be infrastructure agnostic. They won't necessarily care eventually which L2 or chain they're on, as long as the app that they're using works. And the L2 space becomes a commodity to users, really, as long as they can quickly move between the different chains. But it will matter to apps who want to trade off different aspects of security, sovereignty, and cost. So that brings us to kind of RhinoFi and what we're building. we're trying to make a user aggregator layer across all these different rollups. We currently support 8 different rollups, and you can basically explore DeFi on all of them, move between them quickly using bridges, and swap and earn yield. And that's sort of really where we've been focusing, is this interoperability aspect, to make it feel like one seamless network rather than 8 different rollups. We use at the core StarkX, and then also support 7 other rollups, and have had over 500,000 transactions, for example, between these different chains. So final takeaways I wanted to just go to was many of these ecosystems are converging onto a very similar idea of what interoperable blockchain networks will look like. And many of them are underpinned by a similar idea to like IBC from Cosmos, of this kind of protocol level bridge rather than smart contract bridge. And that sort of protocol level communication layer may make smart contract bridging sort of obsolete in many ways. So I recommend, if you want to have a sense of what this could end up feeling like for the overall ecosystem, do try out RhinoFi. We just launched a bridge to Linear, which went live yesterday, and it's free at the moment to try out with no bridging fees at all. We've already had, I think, 10,000 transactions since yesterday. But yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you share my vision for what rollups could end up looking like for our ecosystem.
Does someone have questions?
Thanks, Will. I was just wondering if you could comment on how you think about bridge security in this like context of what you're building.
Yeah, so I think bridge security at the moment, I think, is very limited. And although there are, I mean, most of the bridges that we're using across the Ethereum ecosystem are like smart contract protocol bridges requiring collateral in them. I think that those are a temporary solution, and that what we need to be moving to is something that looks much more like client bridging, similar to IBC. And so I think that's where many of these things like superchain, hyperchain with intercommunication protocols will end up replacing basically smart contract bridging. But basically, I think at the moment, I think really the security trade-offs that are being made are unacceptable, and we see that through the number of hacks that are happening, but there isn't much alternative yet.
Last questions?
Hello. I'm using Rhino Finance. Can you explain, when you deposit some token on the at the protocol level, and you want to invest it on some protocol, how it works with the fees? I didn't understand that.
So, RhinoFi offers various yield opportunities across many different chains. And actually, when you're holding your funds, they're on StarkX Rollup. It's based on the Starkware technology. And you're essentially trading for the token of some yield opportunity. So it might be, for example, staked ETH that you buy with ETH. At the moment, there's basically no fee except when you then exit that opportunity. So you basically get your staked ETH, and then when you would want to go back to ETH, you pay an exit fee, which is worth usually about 2 days of, between 2 to 5 days of yield. So that's how the fees work.
Thank you for the talk. And